In the spring of 1943, Nazi Germany faced an existential crisis on the Eastern Front. Soviet armor had become an unstoppable force, and the Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging tanks faster than factories could replace them. Berlin needed a solution, something radical, something that defied conventional warfare logic. What emerged from this desperation would transform the battlefield in ways no one anticipated. A German engineer named Alfred Nicker looked at a captured Soviet tractor and saw something others missed: camouflage perfection. The Soviets used these machines in agricultural regions across occupied territory. What if, Nicker proposed, they mounted a tank gun onto a tractor chassis, disguised it as a work vehicle, and deployed it as a hidden weapon? The idea seemed absurd. Military brass thought it was suicide, but desperation breeds innovation. They called it the Martyr, the Martin, a small predator that hunted at night. What started as a joke among officers would soon become the most feared anti-tank weapon in Europe, responsible for destroying more enemy armor than conventional tanks themselves. The concept relied on psychological warfare as much as firepower. Enemies wouldn't see an armed vehicle approaching. They'd see a harmless farm machine. By the time Soviet tankers realized their mistake, it was far too late. The Mar carried a 75mm gun, capable of penetrating even the thickest Soviet armor. Yet its open-top design made it vulnerable, leaving crews exposed to machine gun fire and artillery. Every advantage came with a fatal cost. Crews who volunteered for martyr duty knew they were choosing a path few survived. The machine demanded absolute precision from its operators. One mistake meant instant death with no protection, no second chances, no escape routes. Please like and subscribe if you want more incredible stories about forgotten weapons that changed history. This one gets darker. Click that bell. The first MAR units deployed in summer 1943, and Soviet commanders were caught completely off guard. Tank platoon, advancing across open fields, suddenly found themselves under devastating fire from vehicles they couldn't identify. By the time reconnaissance reported the threat, entire squadrons had been destroyed. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soviet soldiers began seeing threats everywhere. Was that a tractor or a martyr? The uncertainty alone changed how they moved, how they attacked, how they thought about pursuit and aggression. German crews, despite their extreme vulnerability, possessed something the Soviets didn't initially understand: positioning and patience. They'd wait in ambush positions for hours, barely breathing, weapons concealed beneath canvas covers and vegetation. When a Soviet tank column approached, they wouldn't fire immediately. They'd wait for the optimal moment when targets were bunched together, when escape routes were blocked, when maximum damage could be inflicted before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The psychological warfare was deliberate and calculated. Germans would leave martyrs abandoned in strategic locations, crippled or disabled, as bait. Soviet tank crews, seeing a seemingly helpless enemy vehicle, would approach to finish it off. Mines would detonate. Supporting infantry would emerge from hidden positions. Surviving Soviets would spread stories of phantom tanks disguised as farming equipment, creating paranoia that spread through entire armies. MA crews became phantoms themselves, young men who existed in constant terror, knowing that their only defense was to remain invisible until the moment of attack. Their casualty rates were staggering, yet volunteers kept coming forward. Something about the weapon's effectiveness, its shocking success against overwhelming odds, inspired a kind of suicidal courage. These men became legends within Wehrmacht units, spoken about with a mixture of respect and pity that only war could produce. By autumn 1943, the MAR had become so effective that the Soviets launched a dedicated counter-operation against the program. They assigned elite reconnaissance teams to locate and eliminate MAR units before they could deploy. These Soviet hunters were ruthless and efficient, using captured methods, martyring themselves, and setting traps of their own. The hunters became hunted. MAR crew under Feldwebel Hans Miller experienced this reversal firsthand during an operation near Kharkov. Mueller's unit had just destroyed 3 T-34 tanks in a successful ambush. But as his crew began repositioning to a secondary location, they discovered they were surrounded. Soviet infantry, moving faster and more coordinated than usual, had anticipated their withdrawal route. Mueller faced an impossible choice: fight from their exposed position with virtually no cover, or attempt to break through the encirclement at full speed, exposing the vehicle's vulnerability, but offering a chance of escape. Mueller chose the breakthrough. The MAR accelerated across open terrain, machine gunfire raking across its thin armor plating. One round struck the ammunition storage area, igniting a fire that spread rapidly through the vehicle's interior. Ammunition cooked off in violent succession. Mueller and his gunner made it out. The loader and driver didn't. They'd survived their greatest victory, only to lose half their crew to Soviet counter-tactics. This pattern repeated across the Eastern Front. MAR units achieved impossible kill ratios. One machine destroying 10, 15, sometimes 20 enemy vehicles. But the crews themselves were being systematically decimated. German high command faced a brutal calculus. The weapon was invaluable, but replacing trained crews was becoming impossible as the war ground on. By 1944, the Martyr had acquired an almost supernatural reputation. Soviet soldiers whispered about mechanical demons that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. Entire tank platoon reported being ambushed by vehicles they couldn't describe accurately. Was it a tank? Was it artillery? No one was certain. German propaganda seized on this confusion, exaggerating martyr claims and spreading stories of individual crews who destroyed dozens of tanks. Some stories were true. Others grew in the retelling, transformed by the chaos of combat into something beyond mere warfare, something approaching mythology. A crew commanded by Oberger Friedrich Steiner became legendary for allegedly destroying 47 Soviet tanks over 3 months of operations. Steiner's unit became so feared that Soviet commanders began diverting entire armor battalions around them. Their known operational areas, effectively surrendering territory without engaging. Whether Steiner's numbers were accurate mattered less than the psychological reality. The MAR had become a symbol of German ingenuity, fighting against overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority. Yet the reality was grimmer than any propaganda suggested. Martyr crews were experiencing mortality rates that exceeded 90% annually. These weren't statistics in military reports. They were young men, average age 22, watching friends literally vaporized when Soviet shells struck their vehicles. The weapon's effectiveness created a terrible irony. Its success made crews more valuable, which meant they were pushed into increasingly desperate situations. High command demanded more kills, more ambushes, more aggressive positioning. The invisible hunters became targets themselves as the Soviets learned their tactics, anticipated their movements, and methodically worked to eliminate them. By 1945, Soviet tactics had fundamentally adapted to the MAR threat. They now operated with reconnaissance teams that actively hunted for disguised vehicles. They moved with supporting infantry positioned to protect against ambushes. They created complicated movement patterns that prevented martyrs from establishing reliable ambush zones. The weapon that had seemed invincible 2 years earlier had become merely another dangerous machine in an increasingly desperate arsenal. German crews, meanwhile, were fighting on their home territory as Soviet armies pushed deeper into the Reich. The psychological advantage of invisibility evaporated. When fighting defensive battles where the enemy knew exactly where they were, a martyr position to defend a fortified position wasn't mysterious or unpredictable. It was a static target that Soviet artillery could systematically destroy. Feldwebel Müller, one of the few original martyr crew commanders still alive, found himself defending a position outside Berlin in the final weeks of the war. His crew had been reduced from 5 men to 3. Himself, 1 gunner, and a replacement driver who was barely 17 years old. The invisibility that had saved them countless times couldn't help now. Soviet armor approached in broad daylight, supported by overwhelming infantry and artillery. Müller's Ma fired 3 rounds before an anti-tank rifle round punched through its thin side armor. Müller survived again, but as he crawled from the wreckage, watching his young driver bleeding out beside the vehicle, he understood that the era of the invisible hunter was over. The martyr had proven that unconventional weapons, born from desperation and innovation, could terrify enemies and change the pace of warfare. But no weapon, no matter how ingenious, could overcome industrial capacity, numerical superiority, and an enemy that learned quickly and adapted faster. In the final months of the war, MAR units ceased to exist as organized formations. Some crews were absorbed into infantry divisions, their vehicles used in static defensive roles. Others were destroyed in hopeless last-stand situations. A few managed to surrender to Western Allied forces rather than face Soviet capture, a choice that reflected how deeply the war crimes and brutality had penetrated every soldier's understanding of their situation. The MAR, which had seemed revolutionary in 1943, became merely another chapter in a vast, incomprehensible tragedy. Soviet historians documented the MAR threat extensively after the war, analyzing its tactical impact and psychological effect. They concluded that while the weapon had destroyed significant numbers of tanks, its overall strategic impact was limited. Soviet victories came through overwhelming numbers, industrial capacity, and strategic patience. Advantages no individual weapon or tactic could overcome. Yet Soviet commanders never forgot the fear they'd experienced, never forgot units being decimated by invisible enemies in disguise, never forgot the psychological warfare of encountering a farming tractor armed with anti-tank guns. The MAR represented something larger than merely engineering ingenuity. It embodied the desperate innovation that emerges when conventional options fail. Nazi Germany, facing inevitable defeat, produced weapons of terrifying creativity because it had no other choice. That desperation created machines that temporarily reshaped battlefield psychology, that forced enemies to question their assumptions. That demonstrated how unconventional thinking could inflict damage far beyond expectations. What circumstances should have allowed? Yet innovation couldn't overcome mathematics. You can't disguise the fundamental imbalance of forces. You can't hide from industrial warfare once the enemy understands your tricks. The Martyr became a ghost story that soldiers told. A tale of invisible death that disappeared when the sun rose fully on the war's final chapter. Military historians studying the Martyr decades later recognized it as a microcosm of larger truths about warfare. Innovation matters profoundly when it generates asymmetrical advantage, when a weaker force can temporarily challenge a stronger one through unconventional means. The Martyr achieved this brilliantly from 1943 through 1944. It forced Soviet commanders to reconsider tactics, to invest resources in countermeasures, to acknowledge that numerical superiority didn't automatically guarantee victory. Yet the lesson ultimately cuts both ways. Innovation alone cannot sustain advantage indefinitely. Once enemies understand the tactical innovation, they adapt, learn, and overcome it. The Martyr's decline was inevitable, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was so effective that Soviet commanders prioritized understanding and defeating it. The weapon that emerged from desperation eventually fell victim to the same circumstances that created it. An enemy with greater resources, greater numbers, and greater determination to solve the problem. The crews who served in Martyrs understood this intimately, often without conscious realization. They knew they were fighting a losing war. They knew that even destroying 50 tanks wouldn't change the ultimate outcome. Yet they volunteered anyway, achieved extraordinary success, and maintained morale under conditions that should have generated complete psychological collapse. This speaks to something deeper than military effectiveness. It speaks to human capacity for excellence and courage, even in thoroughly hopeless circumstances. Martyred crews became respected not merely for their kill counts, but for their willingness to face certain death with professionalism and dedication. That respect transcended national boundaries. Soviet veterans interviewed decades after the war spoke of martyred crews with genuine admiration, acknowledging the skill and bravery of men who'd inflicted terrible casualties on their formations. Today the Martyr is remembered as a footnote in a larger war, but military strategists still study it intensively. The weapon represents an important principle. Asymmetrical advantage through innovation can temporarily disrupt conventional advantage through numbers. Modern irregular warfare, drone tactics, and unconventional military strategies all trace intellectual lineage back to insights demonstrated by the Martyr. How do weaker forces inflict damage on stronger ones? Through innovation, deception, psychological warfare, and exploiting the enemy's assumptions. The specific technology of the MAR is obsolete. No one designs anti-tank guns on farm tractor chassis anymore, but the principle underlying it remains eternally relevant. Every military innovation follows the MAR's arc. Initial devastating effectiveness, rapid enemy adaptation, and eventual obsolescence as countermeasures develop. Cruise exists now only in historical records and veterans' memoirs. Fading voices describing terror, courage, and the strange mixture of pride and guilt that comes from excelling at warfare. A few original vehicles survive in museums, and visitors walk past them without understanding the extreme vulnerability those thin walls represented, the exposure crews endured, the casualty rates that transformed young men into ghosts before they were 25. The Mars' true legacy isn't the vehicles themselves, but the reminder they carry. The desperation births innovation. Innovation generates temporary advantage, and advantage eventually crumbles against overwhelming force. Yet, in that brief window, when the advantage exists, extraordinary courage and excellence can emerge. People can achieve things that seem impossible, can inspire respect even in enemies, can leave marks on history that echo decades beyond their deaths. What do you think was the most terrifying aspect of fighting martyrs? The invisible threat or the crew's willingness to sacrifice everything? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brutal innovations, please like, subscribe, and let's explore more forgotten stories that shape the world we live in today.